Well, I'd like to welcome you all to our Center for Korean Studies colloquium called Korean-Japanese Relations and the Role of U.S. We've got a good lineup of speakers, which Professor Ha, who's our professor of Korean social science at the University of Washington, will introduce later on. So at this time, I really want to thank our sponsor, which is the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in Seattle. This event is also co-sponsored by the East Asia Center at the University of Washington, as well as the Korea Studies program. So thank you very much for coming, and I'll turn the program now over to the Consul General, if he wants to speak. Are you here? Would you like to speak?
Yes, thank you. Yes, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, distinguished participants, and ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure for me to deliver an opening remark at a webinar which is organized by the Center for Korea Studies of the University of Washington and the Korean Consulate General of the Republic of Korea. I would like to convey my special gratitude to all the panelists who willingly accepted to take part at today's webinar. I would also like to extend my deep gratitude to Professor Sorensen, Mr. Marco Garcia, and his fellow colleagues of the University of Washington to help organize today's event. We decided the theme of today's webinar to be Korean-Japanese relations and the role of the United States. As you may all know, Japan is Korea's closest neighbor, and the two countries need to work closely together to foster stronger ties and to achieve peace and prosperity in Northeast Asia and beyond. Accordingly, the Korean government endeavored to manage and further develop Korea-Japan relations in a stable manner based on two-track approach, seeking ways to resolve the problems rooted in history while promoting practical and vital cooperation between the two countries. Recently, Korea and Japan have had problems such as the forced labor and the extension of the General Security of Military Information Agreement, so-called GSOMIA, in 2020, to exert diverse yet principled efforts based on the underlying principle that it respects the judiciary ruling on the victims of the forced labor. The Korean government sought reasonable ways to implement the rights of the victims while taking into consideration Korea-Japan relations. Furthermore, in August 2020, the Korean government decided to suspend the effectuation of its GSOMIA termination notice. As for the comfort women issue, the Korean government has humbly acknowledged that its efforts so far to resolve the issue had clearly lacked a victim-centered approach. We are therefore redoubling our efforts in support of the survivors by carefully listening to them and sincerely striving to fully restore their dignity and honor. Despite controversial issues between Korea and Japan, I'm of the view that the two countries should cooperate to cope with contemporary challenges of our times, such as the spread of the pandemic, global supply chain disruptions, North Korean nuclear issues, etc. Korea and Japan share values such as democracy, human rights, and rule of laws, as Korea shares with the United States. We are of the view that there are clearly rooms to create harmonious link between Korea's new Southern policy and the Indo-Pacific strategy that the United States and Japan have been pursuing. One area of possible cooperation between Korea, United States, and Japan would be to pursue End of War Declaration, since it will mark a pivotal point of departure in creating a new order of reconciliation and cooperation on the Korean Peninsula. We are of the position that the End of War Declaration is not a matter of choice, but a part of the necessary process, and that as a symbolic and political act, it will provide a significant momentum for the talks and actions in pursuit of denuclearization. Before I bring my remarks to a close, I wish to once again express my gratitude to all the participants for attending today's webinar, and would like to stress that if we pool our knowledge and wisdom together, we can indeed make a genuine difference to meet the new challenges of our time. Thank you very much.
Okay,
Let's go ahead and have Dr. Ha introduce us, please.
yes, actually, as Deputy Consul General already remarked, the current status of Korean-Japan relations, obviously is an anomaly. It's not normal. Too long it has been abnormal. And so today, the Center for Korean Studies, as part of the Korean Peninsula Forum, in cooperation with Korean Consul General in Seattle, decide to hold this very timely and important discussion. As we all remember, during the Cold War period, everything was predictable, particularly in terms of Korean-Japanese relations. And the U.S. role behind was very instrumental, for example, in bringing a successful negotiation between Japan and Korea in early 1960s. And then with the end of Cold War and then domestic changes, particularly in South Korea, all of a sudden the situation began to change almost completely. So the relationship has been, I would say, if not turbulent, at least frequently unpredictable. And so even I got the impression that the United States has been taking kind of hands-off policy, so to speak. For example, last month, as almost everybody here would remember, the Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, sat alone in holding a conference regarding reporting the joint the vice ministerial level meeting among the three countries. I thought that's the kind of symbolic kind of the sort of sign of where the role of the United States is heading. So I hope our distinguished panelists today share their wisdom with us as to how to improve upon this very delicate Korean-Japan relations through the role of the United States. Having said that, let me sort of briefly introduce our today's the panelists. First, the Professor Sonja of Yonsei University. He is domestically, nationally, internationally very well known, a specialist on Japan, but his specialties now go beyond just Japan. He has been working on so many different issues, including Japan-Korean relations. He served as the president of the Korean Association of International Studies shortly several years ago. So I'm sure he'll share with us not only his views from Korea, but also about his general views on Japan and beyond. And Professor Robert the Pekkanen of the Jackson School here at the University of Washington. Everybody will know his name. It's well known, particularly his book on Japanese civil society and beyond. So I'm sure he will express his views not only on Japan but also the United States role in this regard. And next, Professor Nishino of Keio University. He is a well-known Korea expert in Japan. I heard in Korea now, where I'm staying, that he frequently visits Korea in spite of sometimes, now is because due to the COVID-19 pandemic, his frequency of his visit to over here is limited, but he is well known in Korea, also not only in Korea but in Japan, with his expertise on Korea and the problems related to the Korean Peninsula. And next, the Professor Andrew Yeo, I always have thought that he is a rising star, but I'm wrong. He's already a risen star on the particularly the U.S. foreign policy in regard to Korean Peninsula and beyond. I remember reading his piece on comparative study between Korea and Poland. It's a well-written piece. Now he's also holding a Brookings Institution's Korea chair, although he's now staying in Manila now. Anyhow, last but not least, the Professor Sonja Jeyong. He is a Rikkyo University professor. His specialty expands quite a bit, but he is now staying with us at the Jackson School as a visiting scholar from Japan, while he originally studied at the Seoul University some time ago. So I'm sure he will share both Japan and Korean perspectives on the future of Japanese and Korean relations. Having said that, let's go first to the Professor Sonja, and then you may take maybe 10 to 15 minutes in your the presentation. Thank you. Professor Sohn.
Professor Sohn, you can share your
Thank you.
You share your PPT if you like.
Yes. Well, first of all, it is my honor to be able to participate in this great webinar. I would like to thank people at the Center for Korean Studies at the University of Washington, and especially Professor Yong-chool, who has guided me academically for many decades, actually. And then I'd like to thank you for including me in this webinar. Let me share my here. Okay, this might be better. Let me show you some of the graphs of the public opinion survey that has been conducted by East Asia Institute in Korea and Kenron NPO in Japan. This is a public opinion survey that started from 2013, when the two countries fell into diplomatic struggle under the leadership of then Madame Pekkanen and Mr. Abe Shinzo. And this polls continued until this year, so we are collecting roughly 9 years of survey, very detailed survey. And this is a perception of the other country. So Japanese perception of Korea and Korea's perception of Japan. And I'll show you a few more data and then graphs to you in order to facilitate our discussion today as kind of an introduction. So as you look at this graph, this blue line is unfavorable view of Japan among the Korean correspondents. And the red line is Japanese view of Korea, unfavorable view. And this Japanese line, the red line is favorable view of Korea among the Japanese. And this line is favorable view of Japan among Korea. So obviously negative perceptions are overwhelming. There are a gap between positive and negative. So it's some 30%. As you see here, for Korea particularly, the lines, usually when you take public opinion surveys toward one country, the perception doesn't really change, fluctuate much. But you see here from 2013, it was 76% all-time high at that point, and steadily decline and rise again here. And you can see the fluctuation is about 20%. So quite wide fluctuations for the Korean view of Japan, particularly negative view. And the positive view also fluctuates here. And you can easily pinpoint that what happened around this time. There's a history struggle between Pekkanen government and Abe cabinet in the initial stages of the both governments. And negative view steadily declined. And here again, we see that as Consulate General just mentioned, that there's a Supreme Court ruling over forced labor, and then diplomatic conflicts between the two in 2019, and that is reflected in 2020 public opinion survey. So this shows that public opinions sway according to political management by the two government or the two leaderships. So we see kind of politicization of the history issues here, and that is reflected in the second graph here. That is an impression of the other countries' leaders. So Korean public's impression of the Japanese prime minister versus Japanese public opinion toward Korean leadership. And you see here, this year and last year, extremely low. That means that for the Japanese people and for the Korean people, Japanese prime minister, this year Suga and last year Abe was extremely low, very unpopular. For 2020, favorability is 1.1%. It's almost a statistical ladder. So almost nobody likes the Japanese prime minister. And things are not so different among the Japanese people, that their view, their impression of President Moon is extremely negative. So that kind of, indicates that here's an unpopularity, large sum of unpopularity of the other country, and also even more unpopular view of their leadership. So it indicates that many comes from the leadership and from the politics at the top. So yes, in Korea, there's a resilient anti-Japanese sentiments and equivalent in the Japanese society, but that sentiments, as you see here, has been instigated by the leadership. So it's very much political than resilient, popular sentiments. That's what I'm interpreting these numbers, and see this is how important the bilateral relationships to Japan and to Korea. Yes, positive is around here. So over the 80% of Koreans view the bilateral relationship as important, regardless of political struggles between the two countries. But you see here that the Japanese line is steadily declining. We see decoupling, originally coupled around 73, 74%, but the Japanese increasingly view the bilateral relationships as less important, and gap is widening. So we see divergence or decoupling. So increasing number of Japanese, we can use the term distancing Korea or ignoring Korea. So that is prevalent. I'm sorry, not prevalent, but that is widespread among the Japanese society. As opposed to the Korean society, many still dislike Japanese prime minister, Japanese policy, but still think bilateral relationship important. And that is reflected in this number, that this blue bar is efforts should be made to improve bilateral relations. Even last year, 61% wants to improve. Here, 2020 means that things happened in 2019 was reflected in 2020 polls. And this year it is increased by 10%. So more than 70% of South Korean people wants bilateral relationships to be improved substantially. But the Japanese is, as you see again, that numbers are smaller than South Korea. Although, yes, this year it is increasing by 8%, but still less than 50% support. Think that bilateral relationships to be improved. And again, what position two countries should take. It's the question, and interestingly enough, conflict between the two countries must somehow be overcome in a future-oriented way, 미래지향적 way, is 45%, the large number supported. And the conflict should be avoided anyway is 28%, as opposed to the Japanese number, which are substantially lower than Koreans. So this shows that the rising demand for improving the bilateral relationship among the Korean people versus still distancing behavior among the Japanese people. So that's the finding that I want to mention. And the next one is then what's happening within Korea. This is another poll made by the East Asia Institute quite recently, a month before. Here's the priority question is, what do you think the priority in Japan policy for the next government that is coming in next May? Here, sorry for the Korean word here, it is actually this. Resolve the pending history issues is 40%, and the future-oriented cooperation in security, economic, technology, health, etc. is 35%, not much difference. So Korean public opinion is divided, but the number is surprisingly high for future-oriented cooperation. So this also is in accordance with the previous trends in the Korean society. And one last thing that I want to mention here is that polarization. Various the issues we see polarization here, the progressives and conservatives. Let's look at the Japan policy. I introduced resolving pending history issues, about 40%, and future-oriented 35%. But if you go to the ideological spectrum, then more than 50% supports history first, as opposed to the conservative, less than 30% support it. Instead, they want future-oriented cooperation in security, economics, and technology, versus the progressive, about 25% supports future-oriented cooperation. So for the progressive, yes, more than 30% wants to resolve history issues first, and then future-oriented cooperation next. For the conservatives, about half wants future-oriented cooperation versus the history issues. So this means that the foreign policy issues have been divided along the political lines or ideological lines here. So that shows that even though the numbers of, let's say, future-oriented cooperation has been increasing. Behind the scene, we see this sort of, ideological or political divide resilient and deepening in the Korean society. So my last point is to what would be the policy implications for the United States from the Korean side. One is that history issue problems have been politicized, and it is difficult for the United States to intervene in this, domestic politics of each country. And we see the historical lessons that actually Obama administration attempted to engage in this, history interpretations and negotiations between the two governments, and that largely, I don't think that it is failed, but largely not effective. So that is a lesson that the Biden administration, I see that they are very cautious in handling history problems, between the two countries. But there's a negative spillover to economic and security issues. This is very well known, and Jisomia is one example, and export control the other. So this is the issue that has been dealt with and should be in closely dealt with among the three countries. So trilateral cooperation to address these potential negative spillover. And definitely what is the point is that history problems should not obstruct the strategic goals. So, how to manage the so-called two-track approach, that one track, yes, discuss history problems, and the other track discuss and cooperate on many non-history issue areas, and how we manage these two and how to balance these two is extremely important problems and issues. And as you see that now currently it is Japanese government rather than Korean government that maintains more or less so-called one-track policy, that you put history issues first, and without addressing this correctly by the Korean government, it is difficult to proceed future-oriented cooperation. That has been the Abe government's policy, Suga government's policy, and now continue with the Kishida government. So we'll see, what happens. But the United States' role is to divide these two issues and have them moved separately. I know that's very difficult problem, but that's what we should do. And for non-history issues, obviously, three countries, find lots of rooms to cooperate. So if we have time, I will continue this. But I'm very sorry, I spent too much time.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sohn. Very, very illuminating presentation, leaving us with a lot of questions, already questions coming in. But basically, you suggested two-track approach, by separating highly politicized historical issue to cooperable sort of areas of economic issues and technological cooperations. Particularly, you urged the United States to keep in mind this kind of dual aspect of Korean-Japan relations. And based upon your earlier, the perception sort of surveys, I'm sure we'll have enough time to discuss later. So I don't want to spend any minute on this issue, which is also very interesting and important. So let's go on to next our colleague Robert Pekkanen. You have also 10 to 15 minutes, but hope not to repeat the precedent. So okay.
Thank you very much, Yong-chool. And I'd like to also thank Deputy Consul General An for his introductory remarks and also supported this event. I thank Professor Sorensen and Marco for their organization, and especially Professor Ha for inviting me and getting me thinking about these issues. So I'd like to really just talk about two things, one of which actually, kind of both of which Professor Ha mentioned in his brief remarks. It kind of seemed to me that he had touched upon some of the main things. The first is what I would like to present to you as a puzzle, the puzzle of the Japan-Korea relationship, the Korea-Japanese relation. And then second, I want to talk a little bit about American interests and American role in resolving tensions. So first, starting out to say that the it is very puzzling that Korea and Japan have such poor relations. If we think about it in terms of the structure of international relations of Asia, both are, after all, security allies of the United States, face a common threat from North Korea, also for the rising challenge of China. And it's this latter threat that has prompted the Quad and stronger relations from the Japanese side with other democracies, India and Australia, and Deputy Consul General also mentioned these commonalities between Japan and Korea. But at the same time, that, as Professor Sohn so well illustrated, Japan and Korea are becoming more divergent, farther apart. Japan is becoming closer with other democracies, India, Australia, also the United States. In fact, with Australia, it's almost even a quasi-alliance to some extent. I do also want to just pause for a moment, and I saw her in the audience, and mention that Professor Ha and I have a University of Washington PhD student, Lauren Hwa-Young Lee, who has also master's degrees from Seoul National University and the University of Tokyo, who's working on this very puzzle. So, and also Professor Sohn, given your earlier presentation, I'm sure that our student Lauren will contact you later about the public opinion poll data. So please respond kindly to her request. So this is a puzzle, and it's something that's, we should also kind of phrase. I was happy to hear about Professor Yo's comparative work with Poland, but this is something that, for those of us who have been studying East Asia for a long time, we begin to take for granted, but it's in no way inevitable that Korea and Japan have such a fraught relationship when we think about the fact that Japan and Taiwan have good relations. The US and the Philippines, which had also a difficult colonial history, have also got good relations. I'm not making a direct comparison. I'm just framing this Korean-Japanese relationship as something that we should be paying attention to and wondering why it is, especially because we see vagaries in the relationship. We see change over time. Korean-Japanese relationship is not constant. And what's particularly notable, I think, for all of us in this audience, is that this relations weren't simply at their worst in the immediate post-colonial period and then a gradual improvement, but in fact, they have soured noticeably in the past decade, right? So this is something that's really interesting, and we can think about why and what are the causes of the variations in the Korean-Japanese relation. That's a very interesting comparative project, but I'll move a little bit to just say a few things that I've noticed in terms of this increased conflict. Most prominent, I think, has to be the rolling back of the Comfort Women Agreement. Also has been alluded to a couple of times already in our discussion today. And also the October 2018 Korea Supreme Court ruling that Nippon Steel and Japanese companies generally are obligated to compensate Korean forced labor in factories during the colonial period. And the following November 2018, this verdict against Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, leading to this, Japan's imposition of export restrictions on 3 chemicals on the grounds that the Republic of Korea's re-export control management was inadequate, removing Korea from a whitelist. I mean, this is really quite extraordinary, but it was the next step, I think, that rang the loudest alarm bells, which was, and it did not come to pass, but the Korean threat to remove Japan from this General Security and Military Information Agreement intelligence sharing. This is really astounding when we consider what's happening in the international relations of Asia. And as I said, at the same time that the Quad is strengthening ties, we see this very public fraying and very concerning possible fraying with the G-Samya. So let me turn now and talk a little bit about the costs of this poor relations. The first, of course, is that this affects the prospect for economic cooperation and economic agreements, free trade agreement, et cetera, between Japan and Korea. That's certainly clouded. And so there is a real economic cost to Japanese and Korean citizens of this diplomatic tension. And turning to something that I think is more at the center for our discussion today, there's also a cost for Japanese and Korean security. It's a direct impact on security, and G-Somnia is the most obvious example of that, but in general cooperation, this does threaten it. And also indirectly, because tensions between Japan and Korea could conceivably affect US commitments to Asia, right? As opposed to a strong trilateral relationship. So that's also, I think, a risk to the Japanese and Korean states. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about what does it mean for Americans. And it seems clear to me that there is a cost to the United States, that security cooperation between Japan and Korea, the quality of that cooperation affects American security. And this is, in other words, it has a indirect effect but a significant effect on American security. And so therefore, I believe that the United States has a positive security interest in fostering better Korean-Japanese relations, however that might be accomplished. So let me turn now to think a little bit about how this might happen. And it seems to me in reviewing recent US foreign policy on the Korean-Japanese cooperation, the United States seems to have two impulses. And sometimes it seems that the US as a military ally to both countries can play a critical role in improving Japan-Korean relations. And this seems to be the case more under President Biden. But sometimes the United States seems to take the position that this is a Japan-Korea bilateral problem that the US cannot solve. And this was more the case under President Trump. But I do want to point out that that Korea-Japan cooperation is essential for US contingency planning on the Korean Peninsula for the DPRK. This involves Japan's self-defense force, also US bases in Japan, as essential elements for American planning. So I think that it is something that is quite significant. Whatever the US policy decision is in terms of trying to mitigate the conflict, it's significant. So the question gets to this, and I think this is one of the things that Professor Ha had in mind for us to think about is, should the US attempt to broker bilateral government-to-government relations? Or perhaps, as I'll suggest in a few moments, an inclusive dialogue of multiple actors. And the question I have, and Professor Ha mentioned this again in his earlier remarks, but it bears repeating. It's quite astounding that US Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman couldn't even convince Korean and Japanese diplomats to share a stage at a news conference in November 2021. So when we think about that, we have to perhaps be somewhat guarded in our assessment of how the US government might be able to resolve these tensions. Also, I've noticed in the press on both sides, there seems to be concern when the US is more involved that the US is taking sides. And so the US, if it has a higher posture of engagement on these issues, does face a risk that it will be perceived as favoring one side or the other. And there could be pushback if the US is involved in these kind of bilateral relationship management. And it could be hard to navigate because this can be quite a charged discussion, it could be hard for the US to navigate this skillfully without such a perception, whether on one side or the other, or whether perhaps within domestic political camps of one stripe or another. So I have questions about the capacity of the US, and also it's fair to say that there is potentially some concern about the outcome. So let me come to my final point, which is to talk a little bit about a broader discussion. And I'm wondering, I'd love to hear from the other panelists about the role that civil society actors, including civil society actors in the United States and academia, could play a role in improving this relationship. So is there a way for US academics, US civil society to play a positive role in improving Korean-Japanese relations? And I think that this is one other component of this is that one criticism of the failure of Korean-Japanese cooperation, particularly on historical agreements, stems from that civil society actors being insufficiently included in the discussions. That's a criticism that's made. So if we're able to have if there are some limits to the government-to-government relationship, perhaps we can reconceive of ways that key civil society actors in academia can advance this relationship. This could perhaps be one of the, take up some of the work of one of the tracks of the dual tracks that Professor Sohn mentioned at the end of his remarks. So looking for a more inclusive process at the civil society level or even academia, it seems to me as one potential step forward. So with that, I'd like to conclude my remarks and thank the organizers again.
All right. Thank you so much, Robert, for your very comprehensive but very, very focused discussion. Particularly, I was impressed with your last comment on the possibility of engaging more civil society and academics into this in this matter. Because even earlier, having heard what Professor Sohn said, at least I don't. Given this very sort of informative sort of data sets, I don't see the survey question about how Japanese people or Korean people look at each other. I would like to see that kind of question, particularly in order to address what Robert just said, in terms of, in other words, Japanese-Korean relations actually have been approached mostly in terms of the state-to-state kind of level, without any much distinction between civil society or society level and the state level. So perhaps I'm sure next Professor Nishino might want to address that issue, I hope. But let's anyhow turn to the Professor Nishino, while I'm thanking to Robert, Professor Pekkanen. All right, please, Professor Nishino, you have about 10 to 15 minutes also.
Thank you, Professor Ha, and I also want to extend my thanks to the Center for Korea Studies at the University of Washington for inviting me to this great webinar. So today I will talk about the current Japan-Korea relations in terms of from the viewpoint of the Prime Minister Kishida's foreign and security policy in about 15 minutes. So as we well know, the ruling party LDP's new leader, Kishida Fumio, was elected the Prime Minister of Japan last October. So many observers expect that Prime Minister Kishida will follow the foreign and security policy of his predecessors, Abe Shinzo and Suga Yoshihide. So clearly so far, we've seen the continuity of the foreign and security policy between Kishida and his predecessors. So meanwhile, I would say that Prime Minister Kishida put more emphasis on 3 points in his foreign and security policies. So first, diplomacy based on democracy or value-oriented diplomacy will be promoted. So since the Abe cabinet, the Japanese government has been pursuing the free and open Indo-Pacific or HOIP strategy aimed at maintaining and developing the rule-based liberal international order in the region. So Kishida will continue to push ahead with this HOIP and focus more on promoting universal values such as democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. So recently, Prime Minister Kishida appointed former Defense Minister Nakatani Gen as a Prime Minister's aide for human rights issue. The second, the Kishida cabinet continues to strengthen the US-Japan alliance and enhance defense capability. defense and deterrence capabilities to cope with the severe security environment in this region. China's military expansion and assertive action around the Senkaku Island require the buildup of Japan's maritime security capability, and also North Korea's growing nuclear and missile threat press for the development of missile defense capability for Japan's security. So third, Prime Minister Kishida has made it clear that he will place more importance on economic security. So Kishida pointed out that securing a supply network of strategic materials and preventing the outflow of advanced technology are urgent priority for Japan's national security. So Kishida created a new ministerial post for economic security in his cabinet. So it is clear that all these characteristics are consistent with the direction of the Biden administration's foreign and security policies. The Biden administration values the solidarity among the democracies to encounter autocratic countries such as China and Russia, and emphasizes the cooperation with the US allies, not only in military, but also in economic security. So amid the US-China strategic competition, the Biden administration pursues to cooperate and share responsibilities more with the US allies, Japan and South Korea. So in other words, current security environment in this region, in the Indo-Pacific region, and the US foreign and security policies strongly demand cooperation between Japan and South Korea. However, the security cooperation between Japan and South Korea has been stagnant for the past decades due to historical issues. It is true that Japan and South Korea signed the GSOMIA in 2016, but there has the crisis of termination of GSOMIA in 2019 due to growing sense of distrust between Japan and South Korea. So as I already mentioned, South Korea's Supreme Court ruling over wartime labor issue in October 2018, which ordered Japanese companies to compensate South Korean plaintiffs for forced labor, has worsened the already strained relationship between the two countries. The Japanese government and the companies have refused to accept the court ruling, saying that the issue has been settled completely and finally by the 1965 bilateral agreement, under which Japan provided grants and loans to South Korea. The Kishida cabinet is sure to sustain this position. The Moon Jae-in administration has expressed respect for the Supreme Court ruling. Meanwhile, President Moon stated in the news conference in January that the liquidation of seized Japanese assets was undesirable, showing his stance of seeking a diplomatic solution in the issue. The Japan-South Korea relation will surely deteriorate further if the liquidation is realized. So neither the government of Japan nor South Korea want that to happen. However, it's quite difficult for both governments to persuade their domestic audience for striking a deal on historical issue. So especially with South Korea's presidential election approaching next March, a short-term solution is quite difficult. So therefore, I would say that Kishida will seek a diplomatic solution with the next South Korean president. The historical issues have already obviously contributed to the deterioration of the bilateral relations. But at this point, their North Korea policy and also the Indo-Pacific strategies have also made it difficult to manage the bilateral ties between Tokyo and Seoul. So when the peace process on the Korean Peninsula was activated in 2018, 3 years ago, by Inter-Korean Summit meetings and the US-North Korea Summit meetings, the Japanese and South Korean policies toward North Korea were clearly divergent. And there's less effort of the United States to coordinate their policies under the Trump administration. So this situation caused friction between Tokyo and Seoul over the North Korean policies. So, but fortunately, the current Biden administration has been paying much attention to the cross-policy coordination among the US, Japan, and South Korea. And this provides more space for cooperation between Tokyo and Seoul than before. So I don't think that the US can play a major role in settling the historical issue between Tokyo and Seoul, but I would say that it's possible and desirable for the United States to provide a venue for dialogue between Tokyo and Seoul by fostering trilateral formula among the three countries, US, Japan, and South Korea. Lastly, I can say that Prime Minister Kishida won the lower house election last October, but still he needed to win the upper house election next July to establish a stable foundation for his cabinet and to make bold decisions on difficult issues, such as a historical issue between the two countries. So therefore, Prime Minister Kishida will prefer to management of bilateral relations and not attempt to the immediate improvement of the bilateral ties for the time being. However, again, the international environment surrounding Japan and South Korea and the US-China strategic competition and the Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy surely encourage the cooperation between Tokyo and Seoul. So if we focus too much on historical issue in bilateral relations, space for cooperation between the two countries become quite limited. However, Japan and South Korea need each other to pursue the goal of their respective national strategies. Japan needs South Korea to realize a free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think that Japan's support is essential to establish and consolidate a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, which Moon Jae-in government is pursuing. So it is time for Tokyo and Seoul to reactivate strategic dialogue and expand the foundation for strategic cooperation. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nishino, for your very comprehensive coverage of issues. Basically, I heard you saying U.S. role in terms of providing venue for two parties to continue to talking about issues. And then also between Japan and Korea, particularly for Korea, your view is that Korea should acknowledge the role and influence of Japan in even building a security regime in and around the Korean Peninsula. I know my summary is not sufficient, but due to the time constraint, let's continue with the next the presenter. Professor Andrew Yeo, please take up about 10 to 15 minutes also.
Great, thank you so much. And I also want to thank Professor Ha for inviting me to this webinar along with other speakers, and also the South Korean Consulate in Seattle for sponsoring this event. You know, when Professor Pekkanen was talking about some of the causes of how we got to the current state of ROK Japan affairs with the comfort women, the court ruling on forced wartime labor, on the export controls. And I remember that I wrote this piece with Celeste Arrington in the summer of 2019. This was right after the export controls were put out. in foreign affairs. And I was thinking at the time, well, the relationship is really bad, but it always rebounds. And I wouldn't have guessed, more than 2 years later, we're still sitting in the same place. So that's not a good sign, but hopefully we can discuss and provide some recommendations of where we can go next to get out of this rut in the trilateral relationship. But when discussing US, Japan, Korea trilateral cooperation, the focus is always on the Korea-Japan leg of the trilateral relationship and how it's hindered US efforts to strengthen trilateral relations, as was demonstrated a couple weeks ago by Wendy Sherman's solo news conference, as Professor Ha mentioned. And I know others on this panel have written extensively about US-Japan ROK trilateralism, but if I can add anything to today's discussion, I would take the focus away from just the South Korean-Japan leg of this relationship and think about trilateralism from the broader perspective of the Indo-Pacific region and how the three countries can strengthen both bilateral and trilateral cooperation that goes beyond Northeast Asia. And so I want to talk a little bit about the trilateral cooperation in the broader context of the Indo-Pacific, because here we see a divergence even on how Japan and Korea and even the US may look at the Indo-Pacific and come up with an Indo-Pacific strategy. As most of our audience probably knows, the US Indo-Pacific strategy was unveiled in late 2017 by the Trump administration. And for this, for Japan, this was welcome news as Washington's new strategic narrative of the free and open Indo-Pacific closely aligned with Tokyo's existing Indo-Pacific strategy. Concepts such as the Quad and the Indo-Pacific had been invoked a decade earlier by former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And once the Indo-Pacific narrative became the lingua franca of the US government, of Japan, of Australia and other US allies and partners, these countries doubled down on the concept and looked to integrate their own national defense and regional security strategies with the US Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, in contrast to Japan's enthusiastic response to the unveiling of the US free and open Indo-Pacific, South Korea's reception to the strategy was one of initial difference, followed by passive acceptance, at least until early 2021. So we have this interesting puzzle, which many have pointed out, but you have Japan and South Korea, two fully consolidated democracies in the Indo-Pacific region that have both forged strong alliance relations with the United States. And together, the two alliances respectively form the cornerstone and the linchpin to peace and stability in Northeast Asia. But despite these similarities, the two allies have diverged in their response to the US Indo-Pacific strategy, whereas Tokyo has developed its own strategy in close coordination with that of Washington and other quote unquote like-minded states. South Korea has been more reluctant to adopt the Indo-Pacific language and embrace the strategic elements of Washington's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. And the Biden administration doesn't add on the free and open part, but we are seeing a continuation of the strategy from the Trump to the Biden administration, and we're expecting Kurt Campbell and his team to unveil what the strategy looks like for his administration any day now. But I want to begin with this broader assessment of the Indo-Pacific because it demonstrates that the difficulty in strengthening US-Japan-Korea trilateral relations goes beyond just addressing the bilateral tensions between Korea and Japan. The prevailing assumption is that if we fix Korea-Japan relations and the two sides can move past historical tensions, then trilateral cooperation will automatically follow. Certainly improved bilateral relations between South Korea and Japan would help facilitate trilateral relations, but Seoul and Tokyo also carry somewhat different perspectives and policy ideas regarding US-China competition, how to address threats from North Korea and regional security policy in the broader Indo-Pacific. And so I'm saying this because it's not just, you patch relations between Korea and Japan and trilateral cooperation automatically blossoms. There's some issues that I think US and South Korea or even US and Japan can also be working on at the bilateral level that can improve the context or strengthen trilateral relations by looking at it within the broader context of the Indo-Pacific. So the U.S. might work to bridge the gap among its allies. And so if I were to give just some general policy recommendations, I think the Biden administration should really leverage its good bilateral relationship with South Korea to encourage the next Korean government to increase coordination with other like-minded countries committed to sustaining a rules-based regional order while assisting Seoul in mitigating strategic vulnerabilities. So, and on South Korea's side, I would say South Korea shouldn't shy away from the region's security architecture, but instead actively cooperate with other actors in shaping the region's strategic environment. There's this perception that Seoul remains on the reserve B team, or is somewhat secondary to the Indo-Pacific strategy rather than the varsity A team. And that sends signals about Korea, not just to Japan, but others in the region. And certainly Korea wants to expand, as a middle power, it wants to expand its global influence. But when it comes to security and defense issues, they haven't been quite as plugged in on the multilateral front. But I think if they were to participate or to engage other states in these multilateral forums or in these different coalitions that the Biden administration is setting up, I think that would help pave the way for trying to find ways to cooperate with Japan and other countries. And I'm happy to say how that would play out. Because elections are coming up in South Korea in March, and I think depending on who wins, we may have a different approach to the Indo-Pacific and even South Korea-Japan relations. I do want to just mention one thing about the civil society point that Professor Pekkanen brought up, because I too have tried to think about ways where civil society can engage, all three actors. And I can't say that it hasn't been tried. I was looking at this report the night before that was sponsored by the American Foreign. I can't remember that organization. It's slipping my name, but they did this track 1.5. I think Professor Nishino was one of the advisors to this group of young scholars looking at trilateral relations. And Professor Sohn and Professor Nishino, they've probably done more than any individual to try to bring together academics to work through some of these problems. But I think even it's beyond. I think for academics, I think those have been among academic exchanges. Those have been helpful, but they don't really translate, I think, to the level of public opinion or to civil society and NGOs, because the civil society groups, at least on the Korea side, which I'm more familiar with, those NGOs that work on Japan issues tend to be politicized as well too. And so on one hand, I think civil society could be helpful, maybe if there are ways to get different groups together in Japan, Korea, and also the US. But at the same time, I also think civil society can be the problem, especially if they're being used as a domestic fodder to strengthen leaders' positions on how they look at Japan or Korea respectively. And I had this piece come out that looked at Korea-Japan relations. It was a question about trust, and look at it using the two-level games framework. So yeah, civil society, I hope it would be part of the solution and not so much part of the problem in improving bilateral and trilateral relations. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. As usual, very provocative presentation. I am compelled to respond to the question you raised because I tend to agree with you. Because we have some sort of fatalistic notion that once some historical issues are resolved, everything will be normal. In other words, somehow we attribute too much to this aspect, frankly. That's why I agree with you. For example, your assertion or the analysis that once this historical issues are resolved, then everything will be normal. I mean, great in terms of trilateralism. I tend to agree with that. I think we should question the post-historical issue situation between Japan and Korea. And another issue you raised indirectly is this: isn't it really true that the kind of long-term, let's say, dependence of Japan and Korea on U.S. security framework, in fact, have become now more or less a prohibiting factor in improving Japan-Korea relations. In other words, I take an analogy. If you have, assuming you have two sons, so two sons equally dependent upon the father, but then one son has totally different perspective from the other, accusing father of monopoly or whatever. Likewise, I think within South Korea, two divergent views coming out of it. Similarly, I think the security dependence for too long between Japan and Korea probably has loosened up kind of interest in strengthening Japan-Korea relations. Anyhow, the leaving also civil society issue, perhaps I know what you're referring to back home here by civil society, but that's a civil society in quotation mark. They are not real civil society in many cases. And so as the Pekkanen implied or said, I'm sure he meant to say genuine, real civil society, which still we need to wait until they come into being. Anyhow, having said that, let's go to our last presenter, Professor Sonja. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for inviting me to this webinar, and I'm very honored to join this distinguished panel today. I'm doing research in the field of Japanese politics at Rikkyo University in Japan, and currently I am doing research as a visiting scholar at the Jackson School of University of Washington. I'm having a very great time, and today I'm very happy to be with you in this webinar. Today, as a researcher who has been watching Japanese domestic politics and development of Korea-Japanese relations in Japan and here in the United States, I would like to talk about what is behind worsening relations between Korea and Japan, and what types of role we can expect from the United States in the bilateral relationship. As other panelists already mentioned, Korea-Japan bilateral relationship is not getting out of the worst situation. Historically, the United States has been placing great importance on US, Korea, Japan trilateral cooperation. And right now, US is very concerned that the dispute between its two major East Asian allies will result in the severing of the trilateral cooperation. Some say that now is the right time to restore relations. We can see, right now today's theme is Korea-Japan relations and US role. And if you try to search, or if you try to find any of the events relating to this same theme, you can find a lot of articles and a lot of events right now. Many experts and many politicians, many actors, many players in Korea, Japan, also in the United States think that there's something we can do, and this is the right timing. But historically, the United States has been placing great importance in US, Korea, Japan trilateral cooperation. When we say that this is right timing, as Professor Sohn has introduced in his previous presentations, when you say that this is the right timing, some say that because we can see the growing awareness of China threats, both in Korea and Japan. And so when we see this kind of common perception and common threats, and something we can, some reasons we need those trilateralism, this is right timing to restore these relations between Korea and Japan. But however, when we see how Korea-Japan relations has been changing historically, the emphasis on trilateral cooperation always existed, and Korea and Japan has been promoting relations with US's mediating role in the course. So I think that the right question we have to set must be something like not just how to restore these relations using like in this new environment. It is not that kind of thing. I think we have to set different questions, such as, despite the needs of such cooperation, what has caused bilateral relations to deteriorate so badly over the past decades? There has always existed a difference in perception surrounding the historical issues between Korea and Japan. This is the fundamental reason on the basis of this dispute and conflicts. But however, I think there are three other factors that has contributed to the recent changes in relations. Each factor in terms of one in terms of national leader, the other one domestic politics, and the last one in terms of international system. First image. I think the factor of political leaders should not be underestimated. Of course, this is very long problem, and we have very structural reasons why we have these kind of conflicts for a long time. But those political leaders in last decades, which political leaders led Korea and Japan, has very important meaning, especially in the case of Japan. LDP, as you know, LDP took power from Democratic Party of Japan in 2012, and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe held office almost 8 years since 2012. So some experts said that it has lost 10 years between Korea and Japan, and of those 10 years, almost 8 years was the term of former President Abe's prime ministership. And in the past decade, he had a significant impact on Korea-Japan relations. Abe was first elected as a representative of lower House of Representatives in 1993. And at the time, there was a lot of changes in Korea-Japan relations. There were first comfort woman issue first emerged in, mainly discussed in early 1990s, and there were Kono statement there, and there were also a very old problem, history textbook problems, and it was it has some kind of consensus during the last half of 1990s in Japan. At that time, President Abe, Prime Minister Abe, former Prime Minister Abe was not satisfied with those Japanese government's positions on the issue of comfort woman or history textbooks. And as we can see from the case of those, verifying Kono statement or looking into what has been done in 1990s or 2000 LDP government or other governments of Japan, we can see Prime Minister Abe, he has been eager to bring those historical issues that seemed closed in the past to light again. And at the same time, we have to point out that on the same period, Japan, the powers of Prime Minister's power and the cabinet power has been strengthened, and the influence of those Prime Minister as a political leader has played a greater role in Korea-Japan relations than in the past. So my political leaders, the factor of political leader matters, but especially in last decade, when those powers of cabinet, powers of prime minister has been strengthened, and it has more influence on the diplomatic relations with Korea. Second, domestic politics. We can point out factors that made it difficult to actively respond to Korea-Japan dispute in domestic politics too. We know there is some criticism that Korea uses anti-Japanese sentiment as a means of mobilizing support in elections. But we can also find similar situations in Japan. Of course, the situation is different in Japan. In the case of LDP of Japan, it maintains relatively stable support base in the elections. And the last decades, LDP, after regaining power from DJP, LDPs were thought to be very stable power in Japan. But those deterioration of relations with neighboring countries acted as a plus when they tried to get us some support, not just election, not voting election. They wanted to gather some support or wanted to have some momentum to change some status quo in post-war Japan. They wanted to change the interpretation of the collective self-defense, and they wanted to carry forward. This is it doesn't come true, but they wanted to carry forward constitutional amendment. These changes in the last decades paved the way to engage in more active way with United States in alliance. So they wanted to have those kind of institutional changes in the last decades, and those bad relations, those disputes with neighboring countries had some kind of plus aspects in those processes. Third, lastly, from the perspective of East Asian politics, the rise of China and South Korea has brought about a change in the balance of power among the parties to the trilateral relations. Like Korea became a more equal voice in Korea-Japan relations, and while solidifying its position as an advanced country politically and economically. And Korea tried to connect those history issues or bilateral issues as a universal value issues, and succeeded in some extent, succeeded to gain greater support from international audiences. Japan didn't like the way of Korea's rise and public diplomacy in international stages. As you can see with these three factors, although trilateral cooperation is the most desirable state from United States point of view, there were some factors that made Korea and Japan think that there's no need to actively seek to improve relations with each other. So what type of role can we expect from US in a situation like this? From the point of view of the United States, which has emphasized the importance of trilateral cooperation, the recent international situation seemed to suggest a clear solution. As I mentioned before, the China threat. This is because the stronger the degree to which Korea and Japan feel that the rise of authoritarian China is a threat, the easier it will be for the United States to convincingly present the justification for trilateral cooperation between United States, Korea, and Japan. However, even though the value of trilateral cooperation between Korea and Japan has increased, I think it is not a good solution to hastily demand that Korea and Japan close their diplomatic confrontation and enter into cooperation. As we can see in the case of the Comfort Zone Agreement in 2015, as you know, there were continuing confrontation between Korea and Japan since then. So temporarily closing those conflicts in a situation where there's not enough will to improve relations between the parties does not help in terms of ultimate resolution of the problem. 2 points should be kept in mind when US intend to act as a mediator in the future. Briefly, first, Korea and Japan, both Korea and Japan have to recognize the need for cooperation and make effort to sit at the same table in a field where they can cooperate and they have common interests. Regarding historical issues, it is important to refrain from direct intervention so that Korea and Japanese parties can negotiate themselves. But it is important to create a environment in which interests of both countries can be shared in other fields, like environmental issues or democracy support or economic cooperations. Second one, when US want to play some mediating role, it will be necessary to recognize the situation in Korea and Japan may not completely coincide with US interest. I think it is undesirable to force Korea and Japan, which has no choice but to maintain somewhat close relations with China, geopolitically or economically, like demanding both countries to clearly stand on the side of the United States. In the US-China confrontation structure is not helpful for both countries and ultimately for the United States too. For short-term prediction for future development of Korea-Japan relations, some Professor Nishino mentioned a little bit about this situations in Japan and Korea, but in terms of individual leaders, the regime that emerged after Abe is likely to approach Korea-Japan relations with a more flexible attitude than former Prime Minister Abe. In the case of Suga, the next Prime Minister after Abe, his political capacity was limited to carry out diplomatic initiatives, I think. But the newly inaugurated Prime Minister Kishida has rich political experience in the field of diplomacy and is likely to be flexible, complex compared to Abe. But on the other hand, presidential elections is scheduled next year, March in Korea. Neither of the major candidates in this election have experience as a member of National Assembly, nor have diplomatic experiences. So we can say that there's many uncertainties about the direction of foreign policies after the election. So Japan think that Japan is very interested and curious about the elections direction because they are.
Son, yeah, let's wrap it
Yes.
up.
Okay. So in the short term, think election we have. So as mentioned, as mentioned, we have some causes that cause this kind of dispute. So U.S. has to be some roles. I have introduced some kind of points that we can expect from U.S. as well. That this is all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sohn. Very comprehensive, but I was impressed with your points on what the United States should expect or what kind of role U.S. could play, implying U.S. is not able to play the same role as it used to play, so only providing environments or the acknowledging different interests compared to the past. So, and then you also review the past pattern of relationship between the two countries and analyzing at the three levels. Thank you very much for your very informative presentation, particularly along with what Professor Yo said. Somehow we might want to expand our discussion on what kind of role the U.S. specifically could play in the years to come in Japan-Korean relations. So we have heard the 5 presentations, very excellent and then clear presentations, the ranging the domestic issues to international issues. So covering wide range of issues by the 5 presenters. So let me just collect several questions from the Zoom audience, and then I'll go back to the respective presenter as in terms of relevance to the questions.
Professor, I have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
So The question was from Walter Hatch. It's for Professor Sohn, Sohn. It was about his statistics and his chart in the PPT. Professor Sohn, if you can please explain why the Korean view of Japan improved steadily from 2015 until 2019, only to deteriorate again. That
Also,
period.
could you read out, Marco, please, to read out all the questions to different presenters?
Yeah, Professor Song, can you unmute yourself, please? If you can.
Okay. Professor Sohn,
So yeah,
unmute yourself.
Yeah, so the question was, can you please explain why the Korean view of Japan improved steadily from 2015 until 2019, only to go down again? So yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Well, thank you.
Please.
Yes. Thank you very much for the question, Professor Walter Hatch. I remember your book on flying geese that came out years ago. I really enjoyed it. I used the term balance of effect when these things occurred, which means that bilateral deterioration driven by history issues were kept in check by security and trade interest. So for 3-4 years with comfort woman issues, not only history problems, but also in Korea, there's the warning from inside that there's a deterioration in the relationship with the United States, particularly in security. So that's the increasing awareness of security interest that has been interrupted by the deteriorating Japan-Korea relationship. So I think that's one factor. Number two is economics. I remember that was a serious issue in 2015 onward, that Japanese investment in Korea significantly declined, and trade volumes also declined at a time when actually trade volumes in the region increased. So there's another warning from the economic community, particularly led by Korean big business community, that we got to do something to check deterioration in the bilateral relationship. And finally, from the data, this is very interesting, that driving force of the improvement is generation 20s and 30s, the younger generations, as opposed to the older generations. And that phenomenon also occurred in Japan too, which means that, we can interpret it in this way, that the younger generation who are exposed to mass culture, popular culture of the other countries, and also they are relatively, I should say, uncontaminated by the existing or older generations stereotypes and bias toward the other countries. They are, and also that they are the generations that mostly visit the other countries. So they have vivid, direct experience of Japan or Korea for the Japanese. So in that sense, I think they have a different view of Japan in Korea, and they have a different view of Korea in Japan. So that's kind of the driving force up to today. And to me, it's an anomaly of the 2019 that there's a severe trade wars and bilateral conflict that also affected the public view, popular view of 20s and 30s, younger generation. But now it is coming back, and thanks to, again, this younger generations increasing popular, increasing positive view. So that's my analysis.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sohn. However, according to your presentation, I don't see any distinction or differentiation of the levels. For example, people to people, people to state, or state to state. So it sounds like Korean people or Japanese people are so easily manipulable by the government. With the deteriorating state-to-state relations, obviously, almost instantaneously, entire populace go along with this kind of fluctuation. Is it true?
My point is that for example, negative view of Korea among the Japanese, these days is, I think it's Mr. Abe's strategy, a very astute strategy that Korea, change the narrative from South Korea's policy per se to the national character.
Okay.
That Korea is a country that does not keep promise.
Okay.
Look at the court ruling. They cannot trust things like that, and that's quite easily spread to the whole society. And also in Korea, that here the Korean leadership says that Abe is a historical, revisionist, ultra right wing, and then Abe is getting vote because Japanese people are also changing, moving in that direction.
Okay.
Actually, which is not always true, but in that sense, they are also moving in that direction. So I think I agree with you, but my point is that the younger generation is not easily moving in that direction because they don't. They have their own views developed from the direct experience.
Yeah, I understand. Staying in Seoul, everything is about generation years. Anyhow, thanks very much. Any other comments or questions, even among the panelists or from the audience? Marco, do you have any question?
That was the only one I saw in the group chat, but if anybody wants to raise their hands, I can unmute them.
Yes, yes, please.
So if anybody, okay, Professor Yo, let me see. You can, I think you're already unmuted. So.
Sure. It's just a follow-up for Professor Sohn and anyone else on the panel or in this webinar. It's a general question about public opinion in South Korea. I think the Genron polls that you do annually on Korea-Japan relations are excellent. I always read the reports just to see what the temperature is in both countries. But to what extent do you think that it actually matters at the end of the day, in that if there's positive or negative sentiment towards Japan or vice versa towards Korea, that governments actually respond? Another example is looking at perceptions on China. So in South Korea, it's quite negative perceptions towards China, but that hasn't really changed the Moon government's policy and how it's been responding or addressing China and its foreign policy. So at the end of the day, these poll numbers are really interesting, but I'm wondering how much it actually factors into leaders' decisions. And where I think it could actually make a difference is if you see that there's negative sentiment among Korean population, but if leaders then break with public opinion and try to make amends or reach out to their counterpart, I wonder if that would be seen as a credible signal of trust, that you're putting your own domestic public opinion on the line to try to improve relations. So in that sense, it could be helpful, but I'm just curious how much you think public opinion actually has any kind of effect or makes a difference on Korea-Japan relations.
It's also about civil society, right? Okay.
Yes, to some you could extend indirectly. Yes, it could tie into the civil society question.
Could Robert, could you address that, or Professor Nishino or Robert, perhaps, please go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, actually, this is, I won't be able to speak to your direct question about how public opinion in Korea constrains democratic actors in Korea, but thinking about it more generally, of course, we have a broad notion that in responsive democratic systems, which we include Korea and Japan, that public opinion should be reflected in some kind of public policy outputs, even if the correspondence is not one-to-one. Certainly thinking about Prime Minister Abe, I'd say two things about Prime Minister Abe. The first is we can recall that Prime Minister Abe, even though he hailed from a very influential and prestigious Japanese political family, he first became very popular as a public figure, which segued into his initial term as a premier, as the successor to the very popular Junichiro Koizumi. But he rose to popularity as a North Korea hawk. Right? So there's some connection to the sentiments that Japanese public felt about North Korea, not directly talking about the South Korean. Turning to Prime Minister Abe, his second stint as prime minister, which was, of course, makes him unique. He's the only prime minister to return to office in Japan. He won 3 elections. Soon after his election as LDP party president, he led the LDP to an expected victory in 2012 after some of the perceived miscues of the very unpopular DPJ. In that election, and then the 2014 snap election, and 2017 also a snap election, Abe ran on essentially Abenomics and economic policy, but subsequent to his electoral victory, he interpreted this as a broader mandate for larger security changes, which was not necessarily central issues in the election. So this is my indirect way of getting back to your point. That we've seen in the Japanese public, there was a period in which China was more popular, but then the popularity, Japanese sentiments towards China became very negative, and Japanese security policy began to be much more responsive to increased Chinese assertiveness. I don't think we could see a parallel thing in Korea policy. At least I haven't seen that, but it doesn't seem to be the case that anybody is winning significant elections in Japan, any of the general elections, upper or lower house, or the LDP party presidential election, on the strength of Korea policy. It's an issue, but it's not a central issue. So there's that, I think, also contributes to this attenuation of this relationship between public opinion and public policy when it's not a central focus. This gives more leadership, more leeway for leadership, which is one of the things that Professor Jeyong talked about.
All right, thank you. Professor Nishino, could you add or make your own opinions?
Thank you. Yes, regarding the public opinion in both countries, Japan and Korea, I would say that public opinion in both countries at this point is in the middle. I would say that the foreign policy of the Japanese government currently, I can say that it's going to the right side, and Moon Jae-in's foreign policy is going to the left side. So in this spectrums, I would say that public opinion always in the middle. So this is what this is the important point. We try to make this public opinion as a common basis to improve bilateral relations. And regarding the South Korean national sentiment during the 2015 and 19, the 3 factors are important from my perspective. Number 1 is a comfortment agreement, and number 2 is North Korea's military provocation between the 2016 and 17, and the number 3 is a bilateral effort to restore the Japan and Korea relations. So especially in 1970s.
On the Pekkanen, right? on the
Yes,
balcony.
yes, it is true that there is a controversy about the comfort women agreement. But anyway, after the comfort women agreement in December 2015, so bilateral relations rapidly recovered thanks to the comfort women deal and North Korea's fourth nuclear test. And after the embark of Moon Jae-in administration, actually the Prime Minister Abe tried to made his effort to restore bilateral ties. So, for example, the Prime Minister Abe celebrated Moon Jae-in's birthday at the summit meeting. So again, the Supreme Court ruling in October 2018 and export measure in 2019 again deteriorated the bilateral relation. This is my observation. Thank you.
Maybe the birthday cake was not big enough. Anyhow, thank you very much, Professor Nishino.
We have another.
There are two questions, right?
Yeah, the first one's from Luis Claro. He was asking, I think this is just a general question for anybody who wants to answer it.
Yeah.
Is there an ending? Is the ending of the Korean War realistic, and what influence does the U.S. have in that? I don't know if who wants to take that one.
Was it about Korean War?
Yes, because I think we started talking about North Korea, and so is the ending of the Korean War realistic, and what influence does the U.S.
ending the Korean War?
Yeah,
Professor Sohn, could you address that, please? Professor Sonja.
Sorry, I did. Which Sohn?
You actually, I meant to. Because
I'm very sorry. I was reading questions in the chatting room. So what is the question?
The question is a ending of the Korean War, is it realistic, and what influence does the U.S. have in helping the Korean War end?
Oh, I see. I think Andrew, you got to answer this question. That's not in my field.
Okay, Andrew.
Can I ask Andrew?
Sure. I just spoke, so I was going to keep quiet, but I can address this in terms of how realistic is the end of war declaration. I mean, it depends what the time frame is, because as we know, the Moon government is really keen in trying to build support for an end of war declaration in hopes of holding a summit, some kind of meeting, diplomatic meeting with North Korea before the end of its government. But maybe I'm not the right person to ask, but I'm more skeptical that an end of war declaration will happen before his tenure, in part because it's, I know the US and Korea have been working very hard to come up with an agreement. We heard that Beijing is also supportive of the end of war declaration, but it's really because of North Korea. I don't know if you can persuade North Korea at this point to come out and also accept or declare the end of war declaration if there's nothing else added to it. For instance, reductions in sanctions or something else to sweeten the deal. And we already know that the United States isn't prepared to do that at this stage. So unfortunately, I don't think at this time it's I don't want to say it's unrealistic, but I think it's just a difficult. It'll be difficult to achieve, and that's not because the Moon government hasn't tried or because the U.S. is obstructing this. But I really think a lot of it. I mean, I'm going to put the onus back on North Korea that I don't think they're willing at this stage to come out unless there's something more involved with that goes beyond the end of war declaration.
Okay. All right, let me just bring here Professor Nishino into this because he's coming from Keio University where there is strong Professor Okino. The previous your mentor who was so much interested in Korean Peninsula peace issue. So I'm sure you can share some of the Keio tradition here, please. Professor Nishino.
So you mean regarding the end of war declaration?
Yeah. The ending, the ending of Korean War, and then the role of the U.S. Or even Japan's role. So.
Yes, again, I would say that so the first three regarding the end of Korean War declaration, the not only the Japanese government but also the many Japanese security experts have quite a negative view about the end of war declaration, because this may worsen the security situation in this region. And so, as we all well know, so we Japanese have U.S. bases in Japan, and this is also playing a role of the U.S. UN Korean UN rear bases in Japan. So in this context, we Japanese really want to see the stable Korean Peninsula, but without any the measure towards denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. So we many Japanese think that we have to keep robust defense measure against North Korea. This is a kind of the consensus in Japan. So in this context, if Moon Jae-in government or South Korean government really wants to realize peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, anyway, so Japanese government support is essential. So in this context, I again say that so we Japan and South Korea need to cross cooperation and coordination, not only in consulting the Indo-Pacific strategy, but also to realize peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. So this is my view on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Marco, could you read out the second question, please?
Yeah, but there's another one. It's let me see, from Karen Allen to Professor Pekkanen. Is it mentioned? Robert, you mentioned that there's a. Oh, hold on, another thing came in. Robert, you mentioned that there's a favorable role of Australia in relations to Japan. Are there sectors or matters of trade and commerce that play into this? And also, what role does Australia play for South Korea?
Well, I'll speak to the first part and then leave for my fellow panelists to talk about Australia-South Korea relation. I guess the reason that I invoked Australia is twofold. First, the dominant fact or trend of the 21st century international relations globally, and certainly in Asia, is the rise of China. And we're seeing states respond to that. And one of the ways that states have responded to that is this strengthening relation with states that could be seen as bulwarks or oppositional forces or kind of countervailing forces to China. That's been at the forefront of US policymaking in the area, and also for Australia. So there's a commonality of democracies. This goes back to some of Abe Shinzo's earlier writings, but India, Australia, Japan, and the US, what do they have in common? They're democratic states, and they're interested, or they see that their interests could be threatened if China becomes too powerful. So that we're seeing for these otherwise quite disparate geographic states, we're seeing this kind of connection among them that is termed the Quad. And so you could also think of an extension, this AUKUS, Australia's purchase of these nuclear submarines for the US. This is also a piece for that. So we're seeing Australia react that way. We also know that Japan's defense reposturing in response to the rise of China is also very well known. What's quite conspicuous to me of that kind of connection is it leaves out South Korea. I think Professor Yo was quite astute to point out that better bilateral relations don't automatically lead to improved trilateral relations, right? But it is, kind of, when we see these other moves, one of the things that does stand out is that the relationship between Japan and South Korea is, the fact that their security relationship has, if not significantly worse, and at least been under, been the subject of concern with G-Samnia. This really stands out in the international relations of Asia. And that's one of the things that I wanted to invoke Australia to bring to our attention.
Yeah, all right. Anybody else jump in to take over Australian-Korean relations?
Can
Professor Sohn, please. Sonja, yes.
I would like to mention an economic dimension of potential Australia-South Korea relationship, in addition to security issues just mentioned by Professor Pekkanen. Two countries have a lot in common in economics and trade, and I think one area that two countries can cooperate is the regional trade order. Currently South Korean president already announced that the country is ready to enter negotiation. CPTPP negotiation. The ministry it's not ready to negotiate, but the situation is that you just mentioned China and Taiwan is also applied for negotiation. Korea is pushing, but currently the government is a lame duck, almost lame duck, that you only have 3-4 months to go. Then so far the biggest concern is the attitude of Japan, whether Japan obstruct the process, procedure for South Korea when South Korea apply negotiation. And there's some, there has been that information gathered by the South Korean government that Japan is not favorable to South Korean application. So in that, but I think Japan will change their course, and Australia is an important country within the CPTPP network. So hope that two countries work together to promote this.
All right, thanks very much. I think due to the time constraints, we need to wrap it up. Let me make a few remarks before we conclude. I think we heard, you just have heard so many different perspectives, ranging domestic side to regional and to international, or with a focus on the U.S. role. Particularly, there is general consensus, implicit or explicit, in these discussions today, that there's enough room and role for U.S. to play, but then the U.S. should be always aware of the changes that has happened or are going on in the countries and in the region. And then let me see, where's my monitor? Okay, the monitor is back. And so the discussions has been very fruitful and then informative. I truly appreciate the participants' contributions today. At least we agree that the relationship between Japan and Korea should improve. It cannot remain as anomaly like this one for too long. But then the United States should be aware what is going on in South Korea, what is going on in Japan, before they automatically think about their role in this context. So let me just conclude by referring to another poll that I obtained beyond what Professor Sohn, this very extensive data set showed. According to Hanguk Daily and the Yomiuri survey, actually almost 80% of South Korean people do not think that the South Korean government should make any concession to Japan. And likewise, 60% of Japanese people also think that the Japanese government should not make any concession to Korea. At the same time, the almost 69% of South Koreans think that the relationship should improve. Likewise, almost same number of Japanese people think that they also think that the bilateral relationship should improve. So this is the way we stand. This is the where where we find some room for the U.S. should play. In other words, both Koreans and Japanese people, not surprisingly, they responded that U.S. should play some role in improving the Japan-Korean relations. In any case, I hope today's discussions actually clarified the need for U.S. role, particularly not just the automatic role or like the role that they used to play during the Cold War period, but more sensitive to local domestic situation. Still, the people in the region, particularly South Koreans, Japanese peoples, they understand the need for the U.S. Role in improving their relationship with each other. So having said that, once again, I would like to express my gratitude to our panelists with their very excellent discussions and then presentations. And also, once again, I would like to appreciate the Consul General in Seattle's contribution to sponsoring this very important timely discussion. So having said that, I wish you all have a good the year-ending days ahead, and hope to see you sometime somewhere next year, either here or there, whatever, in Manila. Andrew, okay, all right. So thank you very much, everybody. So long.
Happy holidays, everybody. Happy holidays.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Professor Ha. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Marco, for it. Thank you, Clark.
선생님
Are you there,
수고하셨어요.
Clark?
Okay. All right, Johnny. Thanks.
선 교수.
수고 많으셨습니다.
선 교수 여기서 봤네. 한국에서 못 보고. Clark, are you there still? All right. He's gone. Okay. All right. 선 교수, 손재영
감사합니다.
교수. 20일 날 가서 만납시다. 오케이.
예, 감사합니다. 선정 교수님 반갑습니다. 예,
네, 안녕하세요. 와, 오래간만이네.
예, 예.
So, 손 교수,
네,
I am leaving on 20th.
아, 그러세요? 20일이면 오늘이
A few days left, but are you coming to the 10th? 그러니까 거기 국제정치학교 와?
네, 그렇습니다. 예.
I'll be there on the 10th. So
아, 그러세요? 예.
see you there.
뵙겠습니다, 선생님.
All right, Marco, thank you again. See
Yeah.
you in a few days.
Yeah. Safe
Or
travel.
if I cannot see you, then have a restful, peaceful holiday season.
All right, safe travels.
Yep. All right. Bye.